Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 6 and the final game of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks, in which they took on the Los Angeles Kings and lost by a score of 4-3 in overtime. Now, in the first 5 preseason games of the year, I didn't really focus on how the game itself actually went, and instead strictly focused on how the specific players performed in those games. And this is because going into a preseason game, the lineups that both teams come out with can vary wildly in terms of strength. One team could ice a full-on NHL-ready roster, while the other is going to be filled with just AHL players, and so there isn't much of a conclusion that you can draw from those types of games. But as we get closer and closer to the regular season, this being the Sharks' last preseason game, as I mentioned, and the Kings coming very close to the end of their preseason, both teams ended up icing lineups that you would not be surprised to see them come out with on Game 1 of the regular season. The San Jose Sharks perhaps 1 or 2 substitutions available, depending on if, let's say, Logan Couture is actually healthy enough to play. The Kings, very similar situation there. And so this was probably as close to a regular season game as you can get compared to an actual regular season game. And so definitely more interesting conclusions to draw from this one. And this game ended up going just about as you would expect for a game between the Sharks and the Kings. The Kings being a good team, but not a great team. Meanwhile, the Sharks being pretty much a basement dweller team. And the thing that I do want to focus primarily on for the San Jose Sharks is likely their biggest question mark heading into this next season. That's not necessarily the forwards, who have gotten, I would say, slightly better than what they were at last season, nor the goaltending, which is kind of similar to where it was last year, but instead the defense, because the major question was how this defensive core would look without Erik Karlsson. Could they rally around the fact that they're all 6 defensively minded players and actually shut things down, or will they just look completely lost? And here tonight, there were definitely some very real issues. If you take a look at the goals that the San Jose Sharks scored and the majority of the chances that they even generated in this game, those were strictly based on what the forwards did in the offensive zone and very rarely involved what the defensemen did. Taking a look at the 3 Sharks goals, you see it's an Eckland and Granlund connection behind the net that leads to the Sharks' 3rd goal, a Hurdle and Hoffman connection that leads to the 2nd one, not even involving the defense much at all. And then the first goal was scored by Granlund on the power play in the rarely seen 5-forward power play unit, because indeed there is nobody defensively for the San Jose Sharks who can actually quarterback a power play. And so it was definitely impressive that the Sharks actually managed to score 3 goals without involving their back end at all, pretty much, but it's not exactly a recipe for success to not really have anything going on the back end. And this was something that we saw frequently in tonight's game. While the Sharks were getting some chances here or there, like the ones that they did score on, what they couldn't really do is actually keep up much sustained pressure in the offensive zone, because that heavily leans on having 2 strong defensemen at the blue line who can keep plays alive. And the fact is that none of these defensemen really are able to do that in any positive sense. They're pretty much as flimsy as a house of cards. And so when you compare the performance from the San Jose Sharks defensemen to the Kings, you could see that the Sharks had those issues forechecking in the offensive zone and keeping a cycle going, while the Kings constantly had 30, 45, even 60-second shifts in the offensive zone. And this actually leads to the other issue that the Sharks' defense was expected to have with the departure of Erik Karlsson, which was that nobody here in this 6-man defensive core could really make a strong first pass out of the zone. Not Ferraro and not Knyzhov, not Vlasic, not really any of these players. Even the players who the Sharks picked up in the offseason, like Burrows, Ruda, or Emberson, can actually make that strong first pass. And so, indeed, most of the times that the Sharks actually managed to clear the puck out of the zone, it either ended up being an icing, it either ended up being because the Kings were going for a lineup change, and so the pressure was off, or the forwards significantly helped out the defense. And this isn't necessarily the end of the world. If you can actually create a system that sort of works around this, it's not going to be that bad for you. But here tonight, you could see that ended up being a bit of an issue for the San Jose Sharks for sure. And that's going to be a big thing to watch going into the next season. Anyhow, moving on to actually how the players performed. As I mentioned, the Sharks lineup is probably very, very close to what we should expect come game one. There were a couple of notable absences in the lineup for tonight's game. First of which, technically Logan Couture, though it's not as though the absence is, wow, I can't believe they don't want to play Logan Couture, but more so his injury, and it is even mentioned that he may very well not be ready to start this season, so he might not be in the lineup for game one, which does throw a wrench in some of these plans for what the lineup should look like from the San Jose Sharks. In terms of actual out of the lineup based strictly on choice, or at least allegedly based, as far as I know, pretty much. The one thing I did notice at forward is the absence of Giovanni Smith, who I was really happy with throughout the preseason thus far, and I expected that David Quinn would also be pretty happy with his performance, but he doesn't actually end up icing in this particular game, and it'll be interesting to see if he manages to draw in and over who come game one. The other very notable absence, probably the most notable one, would be the fact that Henry Thrun did not end up playing tonight's game. Now, is that an indication that he's kind of like the seventh defenseman at that point? Perhaps, perhaps not, but he might end up finding himself on the outside looking in come game one, depending on how Quinn views the performance of primarily, I would say, probably the most likely defenseman to step out would be Nikolai Knyzhov. On the forward side, though, starting off with the players who did indeed actually play in this game, we have a first line of Zadina, Hurdle, and Hoffman. Zadina, I thought, probably his best game of the preseason, though not actually saying much. He has been relatively steady thus far throughout the few games that he has played, probably about a 5-on-10 performance here tonight, maybe a bit more of like a 6-on-10 performance. Pretty good. Actually had a couple of great chances here tonight to score, which is something that we really hadn't seen in the few preseason games he played prior to that, but otherwise a relatively average game for him. He was centered by Tomas Hurdle, who I thought made some things happen on the power play at the very least, but when it came to even strength play, honestly, definitely slightly disappointing. Again, a preseason game doesn't exactly matter at the end of the day, but this is the game right before the start of the regular season. You're hoping to build into something, and at even strength, there wasn't really much building being done here by Hurdle besides his nice little connection with Hoffman on the Sharks' second goal. And then when it comes to Hoffman, I've already talked about how he has been a nice surprise, a pleasant surprise for the San Jose Sharks thus far. He did have a bit of an issue here tonight, which was giving up that Kings' second goal, a miscommunication, it seems, with Mario Ferraro. Gave this puck away and couldn't really recover in a strong way, which allowed the Kings to get that goal to make it 2-1. Didn't end up being a massive difference maker because in the end the Sharks did end up going to overtime anyway, but at the very least Hoffman also contributed positively to this game by scoring that goal as well. So generally been a pretty solid player thus far. When it comes to the second line, we once again have William Eckland. He was playing very well here tonight. Once again, a very strong performance. And I would say if he hadn't already locked down a spot in the Sharks lineup, and honestly a top 6 spot in the Sharks lineup going into this next season, I feel as though this game kind of dots the I's and crosses the T's there for David Quinn. At least they should in his eyes, because Eckland, really solid performance, making things happen. Just a minute into this game, manages to pick off a Kings pass and feed Luke Cunnin in front for a great opportunity. Had the nice play on the Thomas Bordelot goal as well. Just generally a very big positive player for the San Jose Sharks, and he should be making his full-time NHL debut in this upcoming season. He was paired with Mikael Granlund, something that David Quinn wanted to try out as a duo since the beginning of the preseason, but Granlund was injured, finally getting the one and only preseason game for himself, and he's always been a player that I have liked in the past when he's been on non-Sharks teams, and so I was as happy as I could possibly be when it comes to the paltry return that Erik Karlsson actually got. At least Mikael Granlund was an interesting player to get back in return, and I definitely liked his performance here tonight. Contributed on the penalty kill, which was a bit of a surprise for sure. His power play performance as the Sharks power play quarterback in the 5 forward unit was solid enough at the very least, and his even strength play was also pretty good. It seems as though maybe Granlund and Eckland could have some chemistry going between each other. It wasn't necessarily amazing here tonight, but perhaps a starting point and something to look forward to going into the regular season. And then when it comes to the final player on this line, Luke Cunnin, while he obviously didn't generate a ton of offense for himself, it's not as though he was single-handedly making great plays happen. He was in the right place at the right time, which was basically just himself parking himself right in front of the net in the slot and hoping that either Eckland or Granlund would pass the puck to him, and that was not a terrible strategy considering it worked out like 2 or 3 times in this tonight's game. And while he didn't actually end up scoring, if he continues to do that, the goals will indeed come as long as he's not answered in this particular position. So I guess it was a pretty decent game at the end of the day. When it comes to the third line, I do want to talk about Thomas Bordeleau because, as I mentioned earlier, there is Giovanni Smith on the sidelines, and he's a player who definitely could draw into the lineup. And if there's one player in the top 12 here that is perhaps the most likely to get drawn out from David Quinn's perspective, it's perhaps Thomas Bordeleau, because while Eckland had pretty much locked down a spot with a really, really strong preseason, Bordeleau hadn't done as much. He has been pretty good for sure, but he hasn't been amazing enough to really pull himself out of the AHL in my opinion. And here tonight he did score a goal, which was nice to see, but besides the goal actually being scored, he was just somewhat average. Now I will contribute some of that to the fact that his two line mates didn't really give him much support at all, because both of those players were also quite average, something I'll get to in a bit. But at the end of the day, Bordeleau does need to provide for himself, and he didn't necessarily do that exceptionally well. I think he has for sure done enough to earn a spot in the lineup. I wouldn't at all be opposed to seeing him get a third line spot come game 1, but it also wouldn't surprise me that much, though it would slightly disappoint me to see him on the outside looking in come that first game. As I mentioned, his two line mates didn't really do him many favors. Barabanov, after having a very good game 2 nights ago against the Vegas Golden Knights, he kind of reverted back to where he was at the start of the preseason. Not a inspired performance from him tonight. But on the other side was Anthony Duclair, who has kind of gone under the radar and had maybe one of the more disappointing preseasons out of any players on the San Jose Sharks. It was a very exciting acquisition from the Florida Panthers. Was a player who the Sharks are hoping to do very well because they want to be able to move him at this year's trade deadline, perhaps even for a first overall pick, considering Duclair is a former 30-goal scorer. But his preseason, besides having shown off his skills every once in a while when he does touch the puck, there hasn't really been any consistent high level of play from Anthony Duclair, and it's basically just been like maybe once per game him showing off some decent moves in the offensive zone where you go, hey, this guy's pretty skilled, but it essentially amounts to nothing each and every time. So that's something that Duclair will definitely have to improve going into the regular season. Then when it comes to the fourth line, the other player who I would say is perhaps likely to draw out the lineup in favor of Giovanni Smith would probably be Jacob Peterson, who I would say did still have another positive game, but certainly not anything super impressive. Had a great chance in this one right before the Kings actually scored their second goal to make the Sharks go up 2-1 instead, but was ended up getting robbed by the Kings goaltender. But otherwise, not exactly a ton being done for Jacob Peterson, who definitely needed to prove himself a lot in this preseason if he wanted to get a spot in the much more competitive Sharks lineup this year. The other winger on this line was Kevin Labanc, also, as per usual, a possible healthy scratch player. We know David Quinn and Kevin Labanc don't necessarily see eye to eye on a lot, and he's not super, he's pretty quick on the trigger to healthy scratching Kevin Labanc if things don't necessarily go super well. Labanc, I thought, had a pretty up and down game, some issues defensively for sure, but on the offensive side of things, did have a couple of good chances. And then when it comes to the final forward on this line, Nico Sturm, honestly, not a ton to say there. Was decent enough off defensively, although not necessarily as good as you would expect from him, and he was not super impressive offensively, but I guess that's not really what you would expect from him either. When it comes to the defensive side of things, as I mentioned, Henry Thrun not in the lineup here tonight, surprisingly enough. On the first pairing, we have Ferraro and Burrows. Ferraro had also a pretty up and down game, some good things, some bad things, but here's the thing when it comes to Ferraro is that with Erik Karlsson gone, there really is no place to hide. Ferraro is now technically the number one guy for the San Jose Sharks and is likely to get the most ice time out of any defenseman on this team unless someone else steps up in a massive, massive way. And so you're expecting Ferraro to be the player that the Sharks toss onto the ice to defend a 1-goal lead or in a tie game in the last 30 seconds for a defensive zone faceoff, things of this nature. And Ferraro over these past couple of years hasn't really done well in these particular situations. So it's really going to be a big, big thing to watch. I mentioned already that the defense as a whole is going to be interesting to watch, but Ferraro in particular has a big question mark over his head because of the fact that indeed he hasn't been very good as of late, and yet he's being played as a number one guy anyway. His partner tonight was Kyle Burroughs, picked up, as I mentioned, in the offseason, has been okay throughout this preseason, shown some physicality, shown some defense, hasn't necessarily asserted himself as a strong top 4 player, but a serviceable one, I guess. Kind of like a Matt Benning type of situation, I would say. So there's that. On the second pairing, we have Knyzhov. As I mentioned, he's probably the most likely to draw out of the lineup if David Quinn decides to have Henry Thrun ready to go for game 1 of the regular season. That'll be interesting to see. Knyzhov, I thought, had a pretty good game here tonight, but I don't know if it was good enough. And that was really just been the number one question. No Jacob McDonald, notably, in the lineup as well, something I did not mention early on, but I would say that Thrun is probably ahead of McDonald on the depth chart at this point, and I don't see anyone else besides Knyzhov on the left-handed side of things actually stepping out of the lineup. He was paired with Matt Benning, who, kind of like Kyle Burroughs, has had a pretty middle-of-the-pack preseason. You're not really expecting these types of players to actually blow anybody away. The one thing I will once again reiterate when it comes to Matt Benning is that while the Sharks' first power play unit featured 5 forwards, the Sharks' second power play unit did have 1 defenseman. That defenseman was Matt Benning, and it was once again a disaster with Matt Benning on the ice. Please play anybody else besides him. When it comes to the third pairing, we have Vlasic here with Emberton, the newest San Jose Sharks, Emberson, I should say, the newest San Jose Shark player, as a right-handed defenseman, and especially with Gavanke recently getting sent back down to the San Jose Barracuda, he has pretty much locked in a spot, at least until Jan Ruda returns from his injury, at which point he's the most likely to end up stepping out of the lineup. He's been serviceable enough for like a bottom pairing guy, so I don't really have much of an issue with that. And then when it comes to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, as much as I would like Vlasic to be someone who could be an option to sit out, I don't exactly know if David Quinn will have the guts to actually do that, so we're pretty much stuck with him. And then finally, the goaltender tonight for the San Jose Sharks was indeed Mackenzie Blackwood, and this was an interesting experiment to see which of these 2 starting goaltenders for the San Jose Sharks would actually get the start come game 1. Now, obviously, Blackwood was dealt a much worse hand because of the fact that Kähkönen got to face off against a pretty much anemic Vegas Golden Knights squad. Meanwhile, Blackwood had to face off against a pretty much full power Los Angeles Kings squad, so he was obviously going to have a much tougher time. But at the end of the day, I didn't really appreciate Blackwood's performance here tonight. It wasn't all that great. He's a goaltender who I feel kind of nervous with in having in between the pipes, and so I expect Kähkönen will indeed get that game 1 start. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in 1 week's time, and we'll see how the regular season goes. Class dismissed.